For the past 10 years, I have been buying, selling, and collecting video games while recording every single transaction I make into a spreadsheet. There are over 2,300 rows of entries that basically detail everything I've done in this hobby since 2012. Today, we are going to be looking at 2016. The best purchases and the worst decisions I made that year are all going to be shown in this episode of Collector's Diary. 2016 would be the last year of my university studies. I do have a human resources degree, which I have never used. I'm still working as a janitor at this time, about 20 to 30 hours a week, working full-time over the summer and still paying for my university. And of course, putting as much time as humanly possible into also collecting, reselling, and all of this. So for instance here, January 2016, I picked up a Majora's Mask Complete in Box, Ocarina of Time Complete in Box Collector's Edition, Bomberman 64 Box and Manual, and a cartridge only of Kirby 64. And all of that cost me 150 Canadian. About 110, 120 for the US folk out there. For US pricing, just minus away about 25%. So out of that stuff, all I did was upgrade my own Bomberman 64 box and I resold everything else. And even reselling it back then, 2016, I still only walked away with about 170 US. That's just a really good taste there of how different prices were 7 years ago. It's even crazy to say 2016 is 7 years ago. Jesus. But that's how this video works, so say thank you to every single patron who helps support the channel as well as the YouTube members. You guys know I can't do this without you guys. Hit the like button and let's go through 2016. So in January here is actually going to be one of the biggest purchases we're probably going to see on this spreadsheet period. Donkey Kong Country competition cartridge Super Nintendo with the box. And I picked it up on eBay. It was a newly listed bin listing and I grabbed it for 1,700 Canadian. And I ended up making $900 on it, right? Amazing. I have no complaints about that whatsoever. But it is a little bittersweet as I never actually got to enjoy this or anything. So with stuff like this, I would almost always ship it to my middleman in the USA because most people don't ship to Canada. So the competition cartridge came up and I binned it immediately, right? Just purchased immediately. I think after I purchased it, I did send a message to the guy saying like, oh, hey, could you just show me the board inside? But really, it doesn't matter. You can just send it back anyway on eBay. And when I purchased this, the thing is, right, I did resell it. And that's because I purchased it using money I didn't have. Like I said, I'm working as a janitor and going to university. Like I just didn't have $1,700 to spend on something. So I put it right on credit card, hoping that I was going to be able to resell it. And that worked out, which is fantastic. But it went to my middleman, which meant I never even got to try out the competition cartridge. I've owned it, I sold it, and I never played it. These days, the cartridge is worth multiple thousands more. I think one with the box sold for like 7, 8, 9,000, but there was just nothing I could do. I couldn't afford it in the first place, so keeping it was just not even an option. I have no idea when or if I'll ever try to own this again. I'm not going to go through every single game on this list, obviously, but right underneath it is a factory sealed copy of Metroid Fusion on Game Boy Advance. 41 Canadian dollars. That's like 30 US. Complete in-box Mega Man on Game Gear was already over 200 US. That game's basically always been expensive. The Zelda Wind Waker Master Quest bundle on GameCube has also always kind of been expensive. Even back in 2016, it was already selling for around 80 US there. Pretty sure this is much more expensive now. And the final item in January here is actually Zelda Link to the Past, VGA 90 Plus. Picked it up for 165 bucks. That's crazy. 90 plus Game Boy Advance Zelda, 160 bucks. That's like 120 US. So in January, with everything I bought there for the collection, everything I kept, you can see I actually walked away with over $600 of profit, almost entirely thanks to the Donkey Kong competition cartridge. Really good January, really good start to this spreadsheet. Moving into February, we have a Sega Game Gear console, limited edition, factory sealed. Picked it up for 235, ended up selling it for 440. And for those of you who don't know much about Game Gear consoles, this was actually the blue Lion King Game Gear. Pretty hard one to find and one of the only custom colored Game Gear consoles we got in North America. It might be the only colored Game Gear we got in North America, actually. I'm pretty sure I ended up selling it because it had some box creasing, a little bit of ripping in the seal. Back then, you had the luxury of being super picky about condition. Grading wasn't as popular in general, and obviously prices were a lot lower on stuff, so you always felt like you had another chance at stuff. Selling something never felt like it was going to be the only chance you ever had. These days, it kind of feels like if you sell something, you might never get it back. Underneath it is Spirits and Spells on GameCube for basically nothing, $18.50. These days, it's become quite the collector title, but no one cared about this game back then. And this right here is the first time I bought Pokemon Emerald with the big box. I'm pretty sure I've bought it twice over the years. And I was hunting hard for this because I was hoping someone would finally post it without realizing that it's like the rare big box bundle. And sure enough, someone did post it and I was able to pick it up for about 60 US. And I still have that big box in my collection and it's still super freaking hard to find. And ending off February here with a nice bundle of factory sealed N64 games. We got Bad Batman Beyond, Namco Museum, Rayman 2, Perfect Dark, and Miss Pac-Man, all picked up for about 150 US. That's 6 decent factory sealed N64 games there at $25 a piece. Man, take me back to 2016. Wow. Obviously, I wish I would have held on to more of this stuff given how much prices have exploded now, but it was always about keeping the money flowing, right? I simply couldn't keep everything. I wouldn't be able to keep buying and selling if I was keeping too much. And looking at February again, right, you can see I only actually spent 13 out of pocket to add stuff to my collection. That's what it was always about, trying to always be net zero and adding to the collection. March looks like another absolute banger month. So we start off with Rat Attack, VGA 85 copy. This is a really rare N64 game, and even back then it was already pretty rare. Picked it up for right around 150 US, which, I mean, VGA 85 Rat Attack, 150 US, sounds incredible these days. But back then, I'm pretty sure I bought this just to flip it, and I was having buyer's remorse on it. I remember having like a pit in my stomach about this game. It sounds silly these days, but like that was a lot of money. And I was looking at it, and I remember it wasn't selling on eBay, and I was kind of panicking about it, and I finally just sold it. And like, I have written down here $34, which is awesome, but the amount of time, effort, posting, shipping, all of that stuff that went into this, like that's a complete waste of time right there. There's also an Action 52 cartridge right here, which is kind of wild. I purchased it for 150 here, and I resold it for 250 Canadian. That's over 200 US in 2016 for an Action 52 cartridge. That's really close to what it still sells for now, 7 years later. So not every single game just went through this massive pump. Some stuff was super popular back then that definitely fell in popularity now. And ending off March, we have another massive resale here. Kyo Flying Squadron, Kyo Flying Squadron. I've never known how to actually pronounce this game. Basically the rarest, most expensive Sega CD game. I was able to purchase a factory sealed copy of this game for somewhere around 600 US. And I actually did get this graded back then too, and it came back as a VGA 80+. I'm pretty sure it had some rips on the seal. I don't think it was cracked, but I honestly can't remember now. But I did end up reselling this for almost 1,500 US. Kyo Flying Squadron, still super expensive back then. This game has basically always been a grail. And thanks to that game, I walked away in March with almost a profit of $1,000 bucks. 2016 Greg is absolutely killing it out there. Entering into April here, I actually went on a bit of a Sega kick, it looks like. I picked up Cliffhanger on Game Gear, Minnesota Fats on Sega Genesis, just a cartridge, Wardner, a manual for Steel Empire, Task Force Harrier, Skeleton Crew, Granada, Green Dog Surfer Dude, Championship Football and Baseball, complete in box on Game Gear, one of the hardest to find Game Gear games for whatever reason. And I also did send some stuff off to VGA this month, which cost me like 1,100 US. So I basically used all of those reselling profits to fund my grading expenses. It is kind of crazy how much grading in general costs, so whenever I grade stuff, I also try to grade some things that I'm gonna resell to try and help pay for the grading fees. I know a lot of people dog on reselling, but like genuinely, how do you afford this hobby if you're not reselling? Down here, we actually have Oddworld, new and tasty, factory sealed on PlayStation 4. I picked it up for 44 and ended up selling it for 75, made a nice $31 profit on Oddworld. This is one of the earliest LRG games, maybe number 2 or 3 released. Looks like it's actually the 4th released LRG game ever, limited to 5,000 pieces. And I did make some profit on it back then. I sold it for like 55 US, give or take. Just looking at eBay right now, 7 years later, the price on it has doubled, it looks like. We got 119, 109, 96.99 best offer, 135 on this one back in April, 95. So like the price on it has definitely gone up, but it hasn't really done much. And just looking at this Oddworld game here, you guys know I'm not a huge fan of all of the modern LRG, SRG stuff that comes out. This is the 4th one ever printed all the way back in 2016. This is 7 years after initial release, limited to 5,000 units, factory sealed. The price has doubled since release, about tripled. With how many of these get produced now, how many of them are actually going to do something into the future? How many are going to be worth more than double or triple the original retail price? Had I held Oddworld for another 7 years, I would have walked away with like an extra 50 bucks. Quite awful for 7 years, and I would genuinely like to hear from people who like modern LRG games as to why those ones are going to fare any different. And And due to a severe lack of reselling and the grading fees, I did almost spend $2,000 that month. So that erases all of the prior profits. We're like back to a net zero here. Entering into May here, we actually see the cliffhanger box and manual that I just recently said in a video I was gonna keep holding on to it. And it's still only a box and manual. In 7 years, I never bothered buying a cartridge for Cliffhanger. Maybe that's a sign that I shouldn't be keeping it. I had to buy a stupid individual piece for Gyromite. That cost me 20 bucks. It's just like one of those little rail pieces. There's like 7 individual pieces you need for a complete in-box Gyromite. So if you're missing a single piece, like there's nothing you can do. You just have to go buy one off someone. And I got my first Stunt Racer 64 complete in-box this month. I was going for the N64 full complete in-box library at this time. Stunt Racer was also still a grail at this time. Obviously not nearly as expensive as it is now, but still very expensive relative to other games. So it was about 220 US cash there. And then I also had to give up complete in-box copies of Goof Troop, Pilot Wings, and Super Punch-Out, and also cartridge-only copies of Kirby's Dream Land 3, Wayne's World, Bart's Nightmare, Batman Forever, Turtles 4, and Mortal Kombat 3. So like I said, Stunt Racer back then was still very expensive relative to other games. I did end up selling my old cartridge to get back a little bit of money. It did sell for around 80 US back then. And I'm pretty sure this did end up being the Stunt Racer in my collection until the day I ended up selling it, which was about a year ago now. I finally broke up the N64 set, so I finally did end up selling off Stunt Racer. May was also when I finally bought a factory sealed VGA 85 Plus beautiful copy of the best game ever made, Final Fantasy VIII. Was able to pick it up for about 175 US too. Not bad at all. Complete in-box copy of Mario Party 2 here. It already climbed up to 75-80 US. That's May 2016. The price already getting up there for complete in-box popular N64 games. Jeez. And here are some pretty cool factory sealed NES purchases. I was able to get a factory sealed Kirby's Adventure that did end up grading VGA 85 Plus. Picked it up off of eBay for about 70 US, which is just criminal. Like that's obviously way too cheap even back then. But I will say the price of Kirby's Adventure was super diluted back then because this was around the time when all of the Canadian copies had been flooding the market. And even though the Canadian copies should be treated completely separate than the USA copies, like finding a USA Kirby's Adventure is much more difficult due to how much supply and how cheap all of the Canadian copies were selling. People were completely undervaluing US copies. And like I said, this is still an absolute deal to pay for it at the time, but it wasn't worth like $400, $500, $600. You can see right underneath it here, I got Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse. I also picked that up for the exact same price, but you can see Dracula's Curse only sold for about 225 US, give or take. This one was in worse condition than the Kirby, which is why I ended up keeping Kirby and selling Castlevania. Of course, after the month that April was there with like minus $2,000, I had to be doing some reselling in May. And thanks to a bunch of small flips plus a bunch of personal collection selling in May, I was able to walk away with only $100 spent. Much, much, much better. So entering into the month of June here, I was on a buying frenzy, but it's honestly mostly just small stuff. Picked up Shining Force box and manual on Game Gear for about 40 US. Boulder Dash EX complete in box on Game Boy Advance. Pretty rare game, pretty hard to find. I picked that up for 10 US there. Looks like I still must own it somewhere as well because I never sold it and I didn't count it to my personal collection. So somewhere this game is still hanging out. And it looks like the same thing here with Street Racers going on. Picked up a complete in-box copy on Super Nintendo for around 60 US dollars. Didn't put it into the personal collection, never resold it, and that's because it's still right here in my resale pile. It's not part of my collection. 7 years ago I was supposed to resell this. 7 years ago. So has it at least gone up in value since then? It looks like this person cannot get 120 for it. $113 there? Okay, that's something. That's in March. That's something. It looks like this game just literally doesn't sell at all. The copy for 115 is still up there, not selling. Some ridiculous priced ones. And a sun-faded box will not sell for $40. What an unlucky game to be one that I just happened to never get around to reselling. Why couldn't I have sat on a copy of Earthbound or something? Had to be frickin' Street Racer. Looks like the N64 Atomic Controller bundle I was able to sell locally for about 80 US. Not too shabby. Mickey's Safari in Letterland was also literally just shipped off to be sold. Also held on to this one for 7 years for absolutely no reason. At the end of June here though, there are actually two big ones. Starting off with a big resale here. The Three Ninjas Kick Back, the manual only on Super Nintendo. Three Ninjas Kick Back being one of the rarest complete in-box games on Super Nintendo period. So the manual only, I picked it up for $102 and resold it for $465. And it looks like right now you can actually buy the game plus the manual for about $550 US. So 7 years ago, I got about $375 US for the manual only. Again, this is just one of those items that had a lot more interest back then than you really see today. It seems there's a ton more focus these days around Hagane and Arrow fighters, and Three Ninjas Kick Back has just kind of fallen in popularity. And one of the last purchases in June is a factory sealed Go-Go Hyper Grind on Nintendo GameCube. I picked it up for about $35 US off eBay. Pretty sure it was a newly listed buy it now on this, and I got it graded later and it ended up being a VGA 90. Getting it for that was obviously a great price, but I'm pretty sure back then it was still under 100 US to get yourself a sealed copy. A lot of these GameCube Grail games didn't shoot up until 2019-2020, and then obviously we saw what happened from like 2020 to 2023. June overall wasn't too bad, just a bunch of small purchases that kind of added up, but obviously kept some amazing things from my collection. And once I get this Speed Racer sold here, we can take that number down even more. Entering into July here, it's a lot more just small purchases across. I also took some hits from shipping fees here. Every time my middleman sends me a big package, that kind of bleeds me, so it makes it hard to do big purchases whenever I have to pay this off. Here's another couple Super Nintendo purchases, War 3010 and War 2410, complete box copy and 2 cartridges. And again, I bought this stuff to resell it. Why didn't I resell it? Why have I owned this for 7 years now? Very clearly, I was simply trying to do too much. The Mean Bean Machine here on Sega Game Gear, I got a box for it, and it was actually pretty cool because the box itself had never been folded before. I don't know if it came from someone who worked at a factory or whatever it was, but it's always cool to see an unfolded box. Maybe I should have just kept it unfolded, I don't know. Made for a beautiful CIB copy, so I have no complaints. There's a ton more Game Gear purchases on there, so if you're one of the 5 people who collect Game Gear, you can feel free to read those too. But I do want to jump here to this insane purchase, like one of my favorite collection purchases ever. This was for a Super Star Fox Weekend apron, which was used at the actual event by the people who were running it, 30 of the competition pins, 3 promotional buttons, a cassette tape that has an actual promo on it for the Star Fox Weekend, and a VHS that also has a promo on it. I genuinely don't know if the cassette and VHS are even dumped on the internet right now, but I bought that whole bundle of stuff for about $650 US, and I ended up keeping basically all of it. The only thing that I actually resold, whereas it came with 30 of those competition pins, I simply didn't need 30 of them. So it looks like I resold 27 of them total for about 10 bucks a pin. And then I kept everything else, and I still have all of that stuff in my collection. I greatly look forward to a day where I can properly display all of my Star Fox Weekend stuff. And right underneath it is one that I really do regret selling. It is a VGA 85 Donkey Kong 64 controller. So normally VGA won't grade a controller, but if you have the controller actually brand new, which the Donkey Kong 64 controller didn't come in a box or anything, so if you have it brand new with twist ties in the bag, VGA will actually grade that for you. So I had it graded, it got a VGA 85, and I sold it off for about $300 US. And the reason I sold it back then, and this is just stupid on my part, I told myself I was going to keep it if it was an 85 plus. It ended up getting an 85, so I ended up selling it. $300 US for it back then is pretty decent. That's a good chunk of money, but man, I would much rather have the controller now. And even with some decent selling here in July, 2,600 went out, only 1,600 came back, almost 1,000 down in July. Quite frankly, I know I can't keep up this pace, so there has to be a green month coming soon. Entering into August here, I did get Pele factory sealed on Sega Genesis for like 20 US. At the time, I picked it up because it seemed like a really uncommon sports game on Genesis, and it was like very cheap factory sealed. And I'm really glad I did pick it up because these days, these types of sports games that are endorsed by really famous athletes, they get a lot more attention these days than they did back then. I was able to resell a complete in box Minish Cap. Somehow I picked it up for like 20 US and ended up selling it for about 50 US. And you can see that I was right for August here. I couldn't keep affording months like that, so we spent 1,100, brought back 1,200, actually walked away with around 75 US profit that month. I know how much money I was making back then. I could not afford to keep spending multiple hundreds of dollars every month. All that really sticks out to me here in September is I did pick up a factory sealed copy of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, picked that up for about 120 US, and I actually sold it in 2021, I believe. It turned into a VGA 80 plus, and then when prices were going crazy, I was like, why am I keeping this? The price on it had gone up so much, along with, well, basically every other game in that whole boom period, and Killer Tomatoes just wasn't one I needed to hold on to. So it did take 4 or 5 years, but I did make a good profit on Killer Tomatoes, so that's kind of cool. And then also, one of the rarest complete in-box Game Gear games period with Urban Strike. Picked up a complete in-box copy for 200 and actually ended up up selling it for $355. Made a nice profit flipping a Game Gear Grail. That's kind of crazy. And September was a green month, but that's only because I sold the Killer Tomatoes like 5 years later. This was actually another red month. And again, October here, there's barely any buying and selling taking place. There were literally 8 transactions for 200 Canadian dollars. It's safe to say that by October, I was broke. I spent 50 bucks this month. And it looks like in November, I accepted that I spent way too much and I was selling a decent amount of stuff. The first 4 entries here are just me selling stuff from my own collection. I did pick up a box copy of Waterworld though, one of the harder to find games on Game Gear. I'm pretty sure the box I had was smoke damage, so I just upgraded the box with this purchase. More shipping fees this month for $200, definitely didn't need that. And down here actually, there's a massive profit on the sheet for Chubby Cherub Complete in Box on NES. Purchased it for about 150 US, sold it for 655. Massive profit on that, right? But again, this is a game that I sold like 4 or 5 years later. So it looks amazing on the spreadsheet, but at the time, this was actually just a minus 200 Canadian. And same with November totals here, right? It looks amazing. It looks like, oh my god, November is exactly what I needed. But in reality, November was another red month and I didn't realize any of that actual profit on there for many, many years later. The thing with the spreadsheet is I do continually come back to it if I can remember. And entering into December 2016, I'm still absolutely broke. I made 7 transactions total, it looks like here. Spent about 300 Canadian dollars. The one standout thing though is I did get a factory sealed copy of Xenosaga 3. Looks like I was able to grab it for 50 US, which sounds like a deal even for back then. I did keep the Xenosaga 3 and it did turn into a VGA 85 Plus. And then I ended up selling that 85 Plus in early 2019, I think, before everything exploded in price. So that sucked. So these are the overall 2016 numbers here. I had 16,400 go out. That's all the money I spent that year. Eventually, I did end up bringing back 15,600, but like I said, some of that took years to actually realize, and some of this crap I still have sitting here today. And overall, 2016 cost me 800 bucks, or about 600 US. Like I said, I don't know how people afford this hobby without reselling. Hit the like button before you go, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.